I hear the words inclusion and diversity, I start to think of being cancelled. I see things through a simplistic eye and try and treat everyone the same, regardless of colour, background, or etc. I'm going to ask my guest today some questions that some of you may find controversial, but please understand I want to hear answers from a subject expert and I'm not judging. With me today to walk through the minefield that is inclusion and diversity is consultant Sue Kingswood. Sue, you've had quite a varied career to date, haven't you? What made you want to become a D&I practitioner?
It was never a decision. I don't think actually, I'd have to say, to be quite honest, I don't think many of my career decisions, if you can call them that, have been that conscious, which might sound strange, but I don't think I ever really had an idea of what I wanted to do. Um, I think I'm pretty adaptable and flexible, so I'm actually really good at doing quite a few things. So, and I do get bored. I think sometimes I need a new challenge. So I think that's part of the reason for the varied nature of my career. I need things to keep me interested. I need something to work towards. I need a goal. And then when I've achieved that goal, I think I want to move on to something else. Um, so I think, some a role like that would never have existed when I graduated, say, for example, in 1985. Nothing like that
2005,
existed.
did you say?
2000, no, no.
Yeah.
If only, yeah.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, so it was never something I set out to do. I think it came about because I moved down to this area and I was looking for a job, actually having had a car accident. I wasn't able to drive to the job I had in Portsmouth. So I was looking for a new job and I just moved here and a job came up which was part of a wider organisational development role.
Mhm.
And because I'd been a teacher, I'd worked in learning and development, I also then felt I could bring those things to the role. But equally, I think having worked in a prison and having worked on a public inquiry, um, I, and also perhaps my background as well, I've always felt quite motivated towards making society a better place, I think, really.
So what
So
does
maybe there was part of that, and that was part of a new role to do with equalities, as it was called back in, that would have been 2007.
diversity and inclusion actually mean to you?
I think, when you're thinking about those words, they've become almost like dirty words for some people these days. I think in a work setting, it's all about making sure that everyone has a chance to thrive. That's really simply all it comes down to, and that there's an equitable environment that you create in order for people to do that. And I think in societal terms, again, it's about ensuring that people are treated well, regardless of whether they're male, female, black, white, that those sorts of protected characteristics, as they're called. That you create a society where everyone can feel that they're part of that they're included, and that they're valued.
You see, I'm probably many people would readily agree a very simple soul, and I look at it that if you just treat everybody the same, you haven't got a problem, But I appreciate that people don't get treated the same, do they?
Well, there is a problem with treating everybody the
Is
same,
there really?
because if you think, well, if we treat everybody the same way, they'll all be able to thrive in the same way. Then, for example, if you built a building and you put stairs going up to that building on the basis that everyone could use those stairs, you're treating everybody the same. You're actually excluding those people who can't get up the stairs
Mm.
because physically they may
But
not
you'd
be able to
also
do
put,
that.
but you would also put a lift in there that would
Well, you
cater.
would,
Yeah,
exactly. So that's not treating everyone the same, though,
but the other
because you're
people could still
thinking,
use the lift, could they?
yeah, exactly. So actually, when you try and build a world which creates conditions where, regardless of your differences, you can all feel included and thrive,
Mm.
that's not treating everyone the same. That's actually remembering that people are different and
Yeah.
taking those differences into account to create the same equalities for those people.
Before the recording, we talked about your LinkedIn post that you made in
My one
2023.
post.
Yeah, but you said, if I can just paraphrase it, so correct me
Yeah,
if I miss
sure.
anything, leaving the practice of bias to chance is not a risk worth taking if we want everyone to thrive. And you go on from there. Just can you expand on that? What do you actually mean by that?
Well, I think I was thinking of a work setting,
Hmm.
particularly in this regard, and I was responding to that previous Traitors series, not the most recent one. I think it was the one before, where the person that won was had become a good friend of one of the other contestants, who had put her trust in him because she felt he was very like her, and so she trusted him completely. But actually, there was a bias there, an affinity bias, as it would be called, because she felt he was like her. So she couldn't see objectively, she couldn't see beyond that. And actually, that's part of the problem in a workplace sometimes, that people don't think objectively. They think about, naturally, people cleave to people who are like them often. And that can create barriers for other people who don't fit that mold, for example. So you're not seeing beyond the things that you expect to see,
Right.
and not giving other people a chance.
See, I was going to ask you what you meant by affinity bias, because so that is, does that mean, am I correct in it means you're favoring people because they seem to be the same as you?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Okay. So give me some examples of that away from the traitors.
Well, it could be that in any scenario, you see people that maybe look like you, and you naturally, but you might not even realize you're doing it actually.
Hmm.
You might naturally think, I see a bit of myself in them, so actually they must be okay.
Right. And so what is unconscious bias?
So it's similar to some degree, but it's a little bit more around things, assumptions that you might be making without realizing you're making them, based on things that might have happened in your past, or that ideas or theories you've been brought up with that you've never questioned and you've never thought about it. So you're pretty unconscious as to what's going on in your head about why you're thinking a certain thing about a certain person or a certain type of person. So you might have been brought up to fear a certain type of person, for example, and you've never really perhaps given that any thought. And you might be thinking, well, obviously that's true because that's what I know, but it's not necessarily. It might be an assumption.
Throughout your life, work and away from work,
Mm,
have you been on the receiving end of such biases?
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. I mean,
So
I
in what
used
ways?
to, so for a long time, about 20 years, I rode a motorbike, a GSX 600, Suzuki GSX 600F, so a mid-range bike, fairly big. And I used to ride it to and from the primary school I was working in at the time. And I remember on one occasion I got stopped by the police. Now, this guy was on his own in an unmarked police car, and he was following behind when I was coming back from school, and he put a light in the front window, and I thought, gosh, that's the police. I better pull over. I'd have to say I don't think I would have done that at night.
Hmm.
And he
Especially
said
in the
to
light
me,
of the
exactly.
Sarah Everard,
Well,
situation.
certainly
Yeah.
looking back now,
Mhm.
yeah. So he said to me, um, oh, I knew you were a woman. I could tell from your boots. I could see that, and the way you look on the bike. He said, I could tell you were a woman. I said, so is that why you're stopping me? I said, why are you stopping me? And he said, oh, do you always drive that nicely? And I said, yes, which actually wasn't true. But anyway, um, there was no reason he stopped me. It was pure harassment. And I tried to report it, but I didn't get anywhere.
Mm.
So that's one very obvious occasion. I think also there have been other occasions to do with being in a school where I spoke quite differently from some of the other people that were there.
In what way did you speak different?
Well, I'd come from quite a middle class primary school
Hmm.
and went to a secondary school, a comprehensive school in London, where some of the children spoke in a similar way to me, but a lot of them didn't.
Hmm.
And so I ended up having two accents. I cultivate an accent I used at school, and one then that I had to use when I was at home.
Right. I've never, heard of anybody having to do that. I've been filming in schools around the country over many years, and I'm certainly aware that there is a great diversity of student in there. Not just, in terms of colour, but in terms of their backgrounds, and it's quite an eye opener when you see it, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I went to live in Scotland actually when I first graduated, and I've got some lovely Scottish friends, but not everyone was friendly
Well, because they didn't like
because
the
I was
English.
English. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
quite.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, lots of occasions, but then on the other hand, I think anyone who's been out and about and into a club knows that it's much easier to get into a club if you're a woman often and with a group of women than it is if you're a bloke.
Yeah. Is that?
So it can work both ways sometimes.
I see. I lead a sheltered life. I
Oh,
don't
do
go
you,
to.
Chris?
I don't go to clubs.
Really?
Yeah.
I never have been.
Of course not. So okay. Now, in my intro, I mentioned about controversial questions. So I'm going to touch on areas that some people will find uncomfortable, and because you're educating me and hopefully our viewers too. So, okay, on a simple level, if we prioritize one group over another to try and make up for things that went wrong or bad or were handled badly in the past, aren't we in a way just perpetuating bias or moving it towards the other end of the seesaw?
So sorry, what did you mean about
Well, so
raising one group up above another?
well,
In what context are you
okay,
thinking?
there are some jobs
Mhm.
that, for example, fairly close to me, this was a situation that I encountered recently that somebody was telling me that a very well qualified person was not was ruled out of the running for a job, particularly because the company concerned felt that they didn't have enough women in senior roles in that job,
Okay.
right? And so their criteria for filling the role was based on having a woman because they didn't have enough. Now, so therefore, I'm not saying that women shouldn't have jobs. I'm far from that. What I'm saying is that is it always appropriate to say, okay, because we haven't got a quota filled, that we need to fill that quota, and that a very able candidate for the role who is actually the best qualified for the role is therefore ruled out because we needed a woman.
Okay. And in the past, there have been loads and loads of roles and areas of work where women have been totally excluded.
Yeah.
So if we take women as an example here, I mean, you could
Yeah.
extrapolate that out, but let's use women then in this particular case as it's your example.
Yeah.
I think what organisations really need to be looking at in this respect is, first of all, what is it they want to achieve within that organisation in terms of balance, male-female balance. Having a quota is one way of trying to address an imbalance, but it won't necessarily work completely if the culture of that organisation or business or wherever doesn't support it. So if the culture of the business is antagonistic and not ready, and ill-disposed towards that sort of effort towards equality or equity, then any woman that goes into a role where they're not welcome is not going to thrive. So it comes back down to that. So in this particular scenario, and when I've given advice in the past, my advice, first of all, would be to look at the culture you already have and what are you creating to support that integration, that inclusion down the line. But also in any recruitment scenario, it should be transparent. It should be the process around that should be transparent and fair and seen to be fair. And the people in that organisation need to believe it's fair. And then you create an environment where you say, okay, we are going to look for the best person for the job here. And in many cases, the best thing to do is to say, if we have if we are looking to create a more level playing field, male female, what we need to do is say, right, we've got 10 people here who are men, and we've got one woman in this particular department. We want to increase that. We've got women who are applying, who want a role. If you've got a man who's doing it, who could do it really well, and a woman who could do it equally well, and you're looking to increase that percentage of women, then in that scenario, you should be looking to take the women on, because otherwise you're never going to increase those numbers. But it shouldn't be about saying, we're going to take you because despite the fact you're less qualified, your gender is all that matters,
Yeah,
in my view.
yeah,
So,
and
I mean, there
and
might be
that's
people
my
that disagree with that, but that is how I've always approached it.
and that's my view too. Because if it doesn't matter to me, if I'm looking to recruit somebody to my company, in the first instance at a top level,
Mm,
it doesn't matter to me if it's a male or a female. I'm looking at what is their experience, is it
mm,
suitable for the role,
yeah,
and then I look at other criteria that come into it. But
yeah,
at no point does the argument, is it man or woman, come into the mix. And
no,
and that is my belief, that it should never come into the mix. It should be best person for the job. But there is no doubt that in society today that there
mm,
are roles that are expressly favoured for one group over another because of quotas. And you know, I've seen it, and I've been victim of that as well.
yeah,
Actually,
but I
you know,
think, this is the product, quiz, isn't it, of
yeah,
many, many decades and centuries of doing things completely the wrong way,
yeah,
and
yeah. I'd agree with you.
repressing 50% of the population.
Yeah,
So
and it's
I
not
think,
just women, by the way.
no,
We
and
must make that clear.
indeed, and I think in any effort to redress a balance, you have to bear in mind that people are making it up as they go along half the time, because this is new stuff. I mean,
Yeah,
we're only 100 years on from women getting a vote.
yeah,
This is in terms of society, this is not very long.
yeah.
And so a lot of people have been trying to do their best with this sort of stuff, and it's maybe not been working out that well. And I think
So has the
the
pendulum swung too far in terms of people's judgments here? Are they trying to make up too much for things that have gone wrong, or
No, I don't
no?
think so, because I
Okay,
don't I mean, how can you ever really make up for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of 50% of the population not being allowed to express themselves, write, paint, do be engineers, be recognised for all the sorts of things that they could do? And I actually worked with an orchestra at one point who were really, really interested in making sure that there was a greater degree of equity amongst the the musicians, because there had been a tradition of first violin, for example, only ever being male.
hmm,
How many female conductors do you see? And I know that orchestras are working really hard on this still, because I've kept an eye on it a little bit since then. And, one of the things they were thinking about doing was having blind auditions so that you didn't know who was playing.
yeah,
Because
okay,
there was, as I understood it, could be a bias towards women playing certain instruments. And I know at one point, I'm not saying with this orchestra necessarily, but at one point women were not considered, it wasn't considered to be seemly for them to play certain instruments.
right, yeah.
So I
But
think
you mentioned,
there's a long history, Chris, here
yeah.
for a lot of groups of people who haven't ever had the opportunity to really fulfill their potential.
But you made a great point there. You see the blind audition.
Mm,
That's a really. It sounds to me. I don't
mm,
know if there's other problems that it invokes,
yeah,
but it sounds to me like a fabulous solution to what is a recognised problem, and
yeah.
that across society, maybe that, if you like, I hate this expression, but
Mm.
thinking outside the box approach to it it could be a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, of course. Yeah, I think anything that, see, that's a really good example of just the removal of bias
Yeah,
completely.
yeah,
So you're just literally listening to the music, and I think you can use that as a metaphor for all sorts of ways in which
yeah,
you
yeah.
look at how you remove bias from processes which might otherwise exclude people.
Yeah, and if I may sort of labour the point about where the woman was chosen over
Mm,
the man, and this is a very real example, and you know it also has other sort of spin-off effects down the line because
mm.
that woman, through no fault of her own, could be placed in a job that maybe she's not the best for, and it could be equally the other way round. By the way,
I've seen that happen.
yeah, and it could now if that's the case, the company loses out again
Absolutely,
because
yeah.
it's got the wrong people in
Well, this is
the wrong
this
slots.
exactly. This is the thing about getting processes right and
Yeah,
making sure they're fair and transparent
yeah.
and sturdy.
Let's move it on because I mean we've got so much to cover here, haven't we? And and I know that people watching this, there'll be people either getting uncomfortable in their chairs or there'll be people saying, "Oh, having a right old rant," because this debate, it does invoke that, doesn't it? Whether
Oh, this area, that's why I never post on, and I don't like social media anyway.
hmm
I'd have to be honest about that. It's no offense to anyone who does, but it's just not me.
no,
So that's why I
that's
never post anything.
yeah, and
It's
you're
just
always
too
going to get the
contentious.
trolls, aren't you, as well? Yeah.
Well, I think, yeah, yeah.
You never know what's true when you're reading a newspaper, but you hear of the sort of stories where some people have been favoured and perhaps it seems unfair at first glance. And do you think there's an element of exploitation that goes on as well?
I think
Bandwagon jumping, if you like.
I think it's really difficult, isn't it, to
Mm,
work out what's going on when you read anything
yeah,
or hear anything. I don't think you will ever really know what's gone on in a situation, maybe of the kind you're talking about,
mm,
unless you've been party to it firsthand. I
yeah,
think it's hard to judge because I think one of the things that's happening now, I, I'm not saying newspapers quite so much, but I think certainly in the sort of online world, is that it seems incredibly easy to twist
yeah.
and manipulate information, that might not have been correct in the first place. It's a bit of a wild west out there, and
Yeah.
I personally wouldn't believe much of what I heard
And
or read.
exaggerated claims as well, I would
I
say.
would say so,
Yeah.
Chris, and you just don't know. I think you can't tell.
In the USA, let's have a
Oh
look at this.
God.
I mean, this is like a basket case situation at the moment, which is actually, if you look beyond the headline humour that you read in this,
Mm,
you know, it's actually really serious, and it is,
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
we could be on the cusp of a major international catastrophe with war, and
yeah. Mm,
you know, it, and President
scary
Trump,
times.
yeah, it is, and
Mm,
President Trump. Is a very polarizing figure that
mm,
in America there's an awful lot of people who support him and there's an awful lot of people who don't. I
mm-hmm.
think we'll be very careful to remain diplomatically neutral on that because it's not our place to judge who they elect as a president. um, but this week he said Lesotho was some place that nobody's ever heard of. Is this approach, and in doing so, actually, it was part of him cutting back overseas aid to
Mm-hmm.
Lesotho. Uh, is this approach from the White House smart?
No, no,
That's a very nice answer,
no.
straight to the point.
I
Why?
because on so many levels, I mean, first of all, we all, everyone all over the world should be thinking about the global village we live in. Even even if we weren't living in a supposedly connected, although I wonder whether we're more disconnected than ever, but connected world where we apparently know what's going on. Even if that weren't the case, we should always be thinking about connectivity between people, not just between people, but between the environment, animals, all of us. We're all connected. And to cast that aside in that way, to say we don't care about these people over there, they don't matter, some people might not even know they exist, is quite irresponsible, really, because we are all responsible for one another in a sense, because the way that we're connected to one another means that the impact will come back on us somewhere down the line and it won't be good. And we do have a responsibility towards each other to make sure that we create a world which is good for all of us. And we cannot do that in isolation or in a vacuum.
I often read about people such as myself, and I as
Don't put
may
yourself down, Chris.
no, this is how I am occasionally described, as male, stale, and pale, and I've seen it as, and
And
now
what do you
that,
say to that?
well, and I've heard. I'll just finish that, because I've heard about white privilege too. But I come from a background. My parents didn't have much money. My father was disabled. He was a soldier, and he got shot and badly wounded, and it affected the rest of his life. And yeah, and they worked really hard. My mum cleaned offices in the evenings, whilst
Sure.
bringing up children.
Yeah.
And so I don't feel that I particularly had white privilege, and and it sort of offends me, if I dare may take offence rather than it be given, to be classed as white privileged. And when I read that some countries are calling for reparations because of what happened hundreds of years ago now, because of white privilege, I wonder, is that justified? I personally don't think so. But tell me, what about your views on that? Should we be looking to give reparations for things that happened in the past, and that everybody alive today had no control over?
I'm not really aware fully of the arguments for
Yeah.
that, actually.
Okay.
So I must admit it's difficult to comment on that. What I would say probably is that I think it's good that it's been highlighted that people have had to suffer for different reasons,
hmm
perhaps because of empires and the way they've behaved.
hmm
I don't think you can negate aspects of history forever. I I had a lawyer friend once who always said the truth will out. The truth will always come out. And I think as times change, as people's views change, different aspects of history have come to light. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's a really good thing, to raise that awareness of mistakes that have been made in the past, things that have been done that shouldn't have been done. But in terms of reparations, I don't really know the argument. I can't really comment on the argument
Okay.
around that, because I think that's dependent on countries and political decisions and so on, and whether or not that, I think it, one way to make reparations now in any context is to try and treat people well.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, like me, you're Caucasian. For those who are listening on the podcast, they may not appreciate that. Do you think you've got white privilege?
Obviously, yes, because I live in a predominantly white society and always have done. I don't think you can get away from that, actually.
Mhm.
I think
In
that,
what ways have you been privileged?
well, I think that firstly, I was very privileged to have a wonderful upbringing with two amazing parents, and I think that's a huge privilege.
But was that because of your color? Because I mean, you would argue
No, I'm
that.
not saying that was because of my colour, but you're saying how am I privileged?
Oh no, how I
That's
said
one way.
white privilege, particularly
Because
because you're white.
I think, because I know and have known black people who have had different experiences because of their colour.
Yeah.
So because they weren't white, they have had a less good experience than I've had.
hmm
So that's where I can't speak for them and their experience, but I know by comparison their experience has not been as good in some cases. I'm not,
Yeah.
again, that's not everybody. I think it's much harder. Obviously, I grew up in London during the 60s, 70s, and obviously the riots in
Yeah.
Brixton, in the early, wasn't it
80s, I
81,
think.
I
I
think it
think.
was.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I actually went out with a black guy for a while, and there was absolute, there was racism around. So
Yeah.
you know that you're privileged not to have to put up with that. And I remember actually my cousin, who was a rocker, as it were, at the time, into heavy metal,
For
had
those
long
that don't
hair.
know, Sue is a bit, we're hearing that she's a bit of a biker chick, and that she's a bit of a rock star, and yeah, Sue has
I'm a
hidden
rock
depths.
star.
Yeah,
If
rock star
only.
lifestyle.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well, if only, goodness me, Grace. Yeah, that'd be nice. But no, my cousin, at the time, around about that same time, who's only a year younger than me, one of my cousins, we all went to the same school, lived in London. I remember him running down the road to get to a party or something one night and being stopped by the police because he had a leather jacket on and long hair and stuff. And I remember him saying, I know what it feels like now, in a way, not really, but, in one respect, to be black, because the riots in Brixton were about people being stopped and searched all
Yeah.
the time, and just being black was a problem
Yeah.
for people. So I think, you can definitely say
There's a lot of.
there's,
Sorry. Go
well,
on.
I think, yes, definitely having grown up without having to go through that, I've been privileged.
There's a lot more we could explore on
Mm,
that particular area, but
yeah.
I don't want the podcast to become, if you like, bogged down in just racism as a form of bias, because I think there's other areas as well, sexuality being one.
Hmm.
Have we not moved on from the days of, say, gay people having to worry about their sexuality? Does it matter anymore? I feel I don't care about somebody's sexuality.
No, I think it does matter to some people still.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't think we've moved on entirely. But I'm not. See, again, it's sometimes hard for me to comment because I'm a heterosexual woman. So my experiences will be different from people who are gay, lesbian, or whatever. I think you'd need to ask them. But in my experience of working with people who have come out or are still in the process of thinking about it, I don't think we're there yet, but I might be wrong. So that, I think it's for people in those communities to comment on that, really.
Do people of whatever persuasion that have felt the bias
Hmm.
against them need to also accept that there needs to be some consideration for other people's views as well as their own?
I think, well, I think definitely that everybody should be cognizant of the fact that other people might think differently
Yeah.
when they're expressing a view.
And
It's
is
not
that
wrong to express a view,
no?
but I think you need to be aware of that, and you need to be aware of who you're talking to at the time when you're doing it.
Yeah. And that's the point, I think, that people in society now are
Mm.
probably a little bit scared to speak out and call out what may not obviously be a form of bias, when it's from a minority group too.
I think if that's the case, I think the problem has arisen there because the fora in
Hmm.
which that's done are so toxic,
Yeah.
potentially, or rather, maybe they become toxic because they're so febrile um and I think online is a really good example of that. There seems to be no sense of decorum in terms of having a debate
Yeah.
that can result in two people disagreeing and agreeing to disagree and walking away. It has to become pretty nasty, I think, and that stops people from being able to express what they think or feel in a way which is safe, I suppose, in a sense. They should that should be an option in our society to be able to debate things in a reasonable way and then walk away saying, well, okay, I don't agree with you, you don't agree with me, but that's fine, you can live your life and I'll live mine, where there needs to be that level of respect and tolerance.
As handsome and as rugged as what I is, I don't have
No
much.
comment, Chris.
uh, I don't have much hair, and other people have got ginger hair. And yeah, over the course of my life, you take a ribbing about that, and I'm perhaps quite a strong character, and I just laugh it off. If it went too far, I might get a bit angry, and I have been known to take things a little bit too far and being angry as well. But I'd still deal with it.
Hmm.
What stops other people from dealing with unfairness that they perceive? I mean, it seems to be that everybody takes offence more easily than they used to when we were kids. Has Britain lost its backbone?
Backbone.
Hmm.
And backbone being able to take a ribbing.
Well, maybe, yeah,
Okay.
in some elements,
Or
because
do you
not,
mean do
yeah,
you mean has it lost its sense of humour?
well, that too. Both things. Being able to stand up for yourself and also being
Hmm.
able to realise and identify that some people they're just having banter with you. And
Ah, the B word.
I deliberately threw that in because I knew that it would provoke
Yes,
exactly
I
that
know. That's
response.
very unfair, Chris. Using prior knowledge. I think that there's a number of things here. So
Yeah.
again, and maybe this is why I don't like social media. There seems to be a need to be very now I'm going to probably annoy a lot of people saying this, but
But you're bound to.
there seems to be, to a degree, a need to be self-indulgent on social media.
Yeah,
And it's all about personal brand and you
yeah.
putting yourself across in a certain way, which doesn't always enable people to be a little bit self-deprecating,
Yeah.
maybe a bit humble. I'm sure that's not the case for everybody, but maybe that's what's happened over time, that's how it's appeared to me anyway. And maybe there's an element of perhaps returning to a degree of humility, being able to laugh at yourself a little bit more. That doesn't mean to say that you should put up with comments that you find distasteful or insulting. If you don't like them, you should be able to say something about that and actually say it in
And
a
don't you
way.
think you can? Don't you think you can these days?
It depends, I think. I mean,
Yeah.
in what forum you're in.
Yeah.
So I think you should be able to, but I suppose that comes from where are you coming from in yourself? Do you have that self-respect that you can discount everything that everybody says? If I don't think you can be worried about everything everybody says about you, but I think the online world has created a world where people do worry about everything everyone says about them, and then because a lot of people say some very nasty things, and you don't even know those people.
Yeah.
I don't know personally why anyone would put themselves in that position of inviting comment from a whole load of people they don't know.
Perhaps, and this is only one suggestion, but perhaps because they're argumentative, cantankerous, and I'm thinking the more I think about it, the more of those criteria I fulfil.
I'm sure you don't, Chris. But I
But
don't think I think I don't think people are that different these days. I think it's wrong to say, "Oh, it was okay. It was much better then than it is now." And yeah,
every
I
generation
think,
says that.
yeah, and I wouldn't say that because I don't think it's true. I think that there's good and bad in every single era that you go through, and I think what's worrying is that things in certain aspects of our lives are moving at an incredible rate. You know, the incredible rate of um, technological change, for example,
Mm.
IT change, that sort of thing. I think that's going so fast at a rate that people can't keep up with. That's quite scary. But I think generally people are people and they don't really change in essence. It's times and the times they live in and the things that they come into contact with that change, but actually people don't change generally, and it's a question of whether or not you want to be a certain type of person and you respect yourself for who you are and you want to be able to laugh at yourself and laugh off comments and do that, because actually if you don't have a sense of humor in life and you don't apply that, it's a pretty dreary world and you probably won't survive.
If
To
I,
me, it's imperative that you have a sense of humor to actually get through the really tough times in life.
the one thing that I keep coming back to, or we both keep coming back to, is trying to find balance in life
Mm,
these days. And
yeah.
and I, as I get older, and I feel positively old sometimes, it's harder to find that balance. And
Mm,
I mean, we've got a culture now, which people can say the wrong thing once, and it's going back to your social media toxicity. You can say the wrong thing. And suddenly you're ostracized from society in the online world, which becomes, it can affect your job, etc. I'm not so sure that's a good thing for us as humans. In fact, I think it's a bad thing, this cancel culture. If people do wrong, they've got to be punished. But you know, but the cancel culture that is invoked. What do you think?
well, as I say, I don't get
Mm.
involved in the online world, and it seems odd to me that the word you can't cancel a person. They're still there. They're not
No, but
going anywhere, and it's clearly whatever it's meant to do is clearly not working, because the people that are really dangerous online are still out there.
it's not just online though. I mean, in it is a sort of a buzzword, a cancel culture,
Mm,
but it's an attempt to destroy somebody, and
mm,
sometimes it's for a relatively menial thing. Not always, and I'm not looking at the extremes of that, because that can be dealt with in other ways. But for relatively minor things in life, they can be taken to extremes by some elements of society these days with a driven aim to just wreck that person's life, almost as if they're getting a buzz from it themselves.
Well, clearly that isn't right, and I
Yeah.
don't think anyone should set out to do that.
But it does go on so much
I'm
these
sure
days.
it does. No, and I wouldn't agree with anyone setting out to destroy someone else's life on the
Mm,
basis of one thing they've said or think they've said.
mm.
I think there was something around J.K. Rowling, wasn't
Yeah,
there?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, she's a good example. Yeah.
And I think that's a really good example as well because she's a writer.
Mm,
And when you look back at the canon of literature, particularly in English literature, when I studied English literature, you didn't study the writers for their views and then apply a theory about that or a view of their lifestyle to their work. You studied the text, you studied the work. And I think maybe one of the things that's happened is that, particularly in maybe the case of someone like J.K. Rowling, it's a good example of where this obsession with personal brand and being the person first and the author second has got mixed up. It's the wrong way round. You need to be able to, especially with literature, look at the text, make a decision about the text, not make a decision about the text based on whether or not you think you like the way that author lives their life or the views they hold.
yeah.
And I think that's a case in point because we're mixing up here. And who is without blemish?
Yeah, none of us. We're getting very close to the end of the program, and I want to cover two areas very quickly. First of all, something I have difficulty with is changing language. Words that I grew up with, which some are obviously unacceptable, but some less so.
Okay.
And how do you, in your role,
Mm-hmm.
encourage people to consider their language?
Language changes,
Yeah.
and obviously having studied English, you know that more than anything, and I think it's fascinating. Language changes all the time. There are new words being added to the dictionary, and I think it's a fascinating topic actually, how that develops, what idioms develop, and so on. And I think it's just another way that people can help themselves to connect better with others, to understand how language can help them to do that or also hinder that.
Yeah. I
So
mean,
it's being aware really. And actually it's not about saying to somebody, and I have dealt with this a lot in my role. I mean, it's not about saying to somebody you're wrong. It's just maybe explaining that in a certain context, a certain word might not be relevant or useful anymore in terms of creating harmony
there,
between people.
there are definitely instances where people have been heavily criticised for using words that if they grew up with
Hmm.
in the modern day, as in they grew up, but now using those same words in the modern day,
Yeah.
um, and genuinely not being aware that the context of that word or the use of that word has changed.
Hmm.
One example that I can think of, it was a few years back, but
Hmm.
Alan Hansen on Match of the Day referred to a footballer um, as, if I can say this word without offending anybody, because I'm not trying to offend anybody, he referred to the footballer as a coloured footballer.
Hmm.
Right. And he was immediately castigated for that as a racist. And it did blow over eventually,
Mm.
and as it, as it was proven, it wasn't about him being a racist. He wasn't aware of the change of use of the language, and
Mm.
I think that's something that is perhaps in society not always accepted. That it's hard to pick up on those changes, and it seems to be accelerating those changes as well. Maybe it's just I'm getting older, but it does seem to
Yeah,
be.
I mean, it probably is, I think. And I think it depends if somebody's going to be a broadcaster, it behoves them to do a little bit of research on that front. And I think you can't be blamed for not knowing every single term and how it's changed. But I think
But
in
you
a
just blamed
work,
him for not knowing it.
well, I think in a work context, if part of your work is to communicate with others, you need to do your homework on how best to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes into that category.
Yeah.
It's not best to not be aware of the way that language is changing, because that's not going to help. And clearly it didn't.
Yeah, no, it didn't. It was a big storm. Yeah.
That's not to criticize the person. This is where, in a work context particularly, if you're dealing with people and if you're a communicator, then you really need to be on your game there.
Yeah, good point. And as I said, we've actually run over time. This is great, and we haven't even covered. This has happened the last 3 weeks in a row. Actually, when I've done these, that we haven't even covered half of my questions. But I wanted to talk about disabled people, and has there been enough change in our society over the past, say, and this is a random figure, say 20 years, whereby we've taken on board the problems that people with disabilities face?
I've done quite a lot of work on this, and I think probably not. Although that's not to say there isn't a lot of work being done. I think, again, it's a question for the people in that community largely to answer and say what their experiences are. I think there's more being done. I think in certain contexts, in a lot of organisations, definitely a lot more being done. But I'm sure we're not there yet for a lot of people.
Can you give me some examples of things that you would like to see improve for disabled people in the workplace?
I think it's been great, people like Chris Packham bringing awareness in terms of things like autism, because I think it's difficult for people in the workplace often to understand hidden disabilities, which that would be classed as often. It's maybe sometimes easier for people to see if somebody needs an assistance dog or something like that, and they might be able to make some adjustments. So I think it's awareness raising, really, and that's something that often people are very keen to become involved with. They want to know how to do things differently. But it's not always easy, because I think, and I'm sure the disabled community will say this, for each person it's different, and how, but there are things that, say, for example, somebody who has sight loss would find useful in a workplace. It depends what they do. Depends what that workplace is all about, depends what they need. And I think it's about looking, again, it's coming back to your original point about treating everyone the same. You can't do that necessarily. You need to look at what they need in that particular scenario, and then try and meet those needs as best you can.
Sue, we're out of time. This has been a great, and I'd like to say, for me, educational experience. And there are things that I can think, okay, I can see how I can change things. Have you enjoyed it?
Yes, yeah, I have actually. It's been great. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to have a chat with you, Chris. It's been lovely.
Thanks very much for coming in. And that's the end of the program.
Thank you.
Well, what a great chat that was, everybody. And I'm sure that there's going to be some feedback on some of the areas we've covered, and everybody's going to have a view. So by all means, put them in the comments. Join us again.